All right, so today we're diving into something pretty major. Justin Trudeau's resignation as Prime Minister of Canada. You've been asking about why he decided to step down just weeks before Trump starts his second term as U.S. president. And of course, what this all means for Canada, particularly its relationships with the U.S. and India. We've got a lot to unpack from Wikipedia articles, news reports, all that good stuff. But before we even get into that, one thing that really stood out to me was the timing. I mean, it's almost like a repeat of what happened with Brian Mulroney, and another Canadian Prime Minister. He resigned back in 1993 also, right before a new U.S. president took office. So is there a connection there, or is it just a coincidence? To help us figure all of this out, we've got with us today an expert in Canadian politics and U.S.-Canada relations.
Well, it's definitely an interesting parallel, and it makes you think. Every political situation is different, of course, but looking at the context of both resignations is important. Mulroney was dealing with declining popularity and a changing political scene in Canada, much like Trudeau is now. But having a new U.S. president about to step in, especially someone like Trump, who hasn't exactly been shy about criticizing Canada and Trudeau himself, well, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to things.
Yeah, Trump definitely hasn't held back on his opinions about Canada, has he? I remember reading about him wanting to slap those huge tariffs on Canadian goods and even calling Trudeau a governor. Ouch.
It definitely wasn't a compliment, and a lot of Canadians felt it was pretty disrespectful. You have to remember that Canada depends a lot on its trade with the U.S., so Trump's protectionist policies and talk about winners and losers in trade deals created a lot of anxiety.
So with all that in mind, do you think those potential economic hits from Trump's policies played a part in Trudeau's decision? Was he maybe worried about being the one to lead Canada through all that?
It's hard to say with absolute certainty, but it's definitely something to consider. Trudeau's Liberal Party was already seeing a dip in popularity, and the idea of facing a Trump administration that's ready to shake up trade deals and maybe even impose tariffs, well, it might have added to the feeling that it was time for a change in leadership.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like going into a tough negotiation knowing the other side is going to play hardball. You'd probably start to question if you were really the right person to handle it.
Exactly. And on top of those economic pressures, there's also the whole issue of how to manage the diplomatic relationship with the U.S. under another Trump term. Trudeau already had some pretty tense moments with him, and the thought of another 4 years of unpredictable and potentially hostile interactions, well, it might not have been all that appealing.
Especially considering how important a good relationship with the U.S. is for Canada. They're not just our biggest trading partner, but a crucial ally when it comes to security and defense, too.
Exactly. And while Trudeau managed to keep things somewhat functional with Trump during his first term, it wasn't always smooth sailing. It's hard to say if that could have lasted another 4 years.
So we've got Trump and the potential economic and diplomatic fallout from his policies as one piece of the puzzle. But what about the political situation within Canada itself? Our sources mention Trudeau's declining popularity and internal struggles within the Liberal Party. Did those things play a role in his decision too?
Absolutely. Trudeau was facing growing discontent from within his own party. Recent losses in by-elections, even in places that were usually safe for the Liberals, showed that voters were starting to lose faith.
What were some of the big issues driving that discontent? I know the sources mentioned a housing affordability crisis and how Trudeau handled immigration.
Yeah, those were definitely contributing factors. Some Canadians felt that his immigration policies were making the housing situation worse, especially in big cities like Toronto and Vancouver. And then there were the lingering questions about how he dealt with certain controversies, like the brown face scandal from the 2019 election. You know, when those pictures came out of him wearing brown face makeup at different events earlier in his life. It came up again during the campaign and raised concerns about his judgment and sensitivity to issues of race. He did apologize for it, but it definitely hurt his image with some voters.
It sounds like Trudeau was facing a whole bunch of challenges all at once, both at home and on the world stage.
Definitely. The declining popularity, the struggles within his own party, and the pressure of another Trump presidency all likely came together to create a feeling that it was time for a change in leadership.
And speaking of international relations, we've talked about the crucial importance of the U.S. relationship for Canada.
Yeah.
But the sources also touch upon Trudeau's relationship with India, which seems to have been pretty strained.
That's right. The relationship with India has been complicated by accusations that the Indian government was involved in the death of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. That incident led to diplomatic tensions and a cooling of relations between the two countries.
Wow. So on top of dealing with the U.S. under a second Trump term, Trudeau also had this whole complex situation with India to handle. It sounds like he was juggling a lot of sensitive diplomatic issues.
He was.
Oh,
And the fact that he chose to resign just a few weeks before Trump's inauguration adds another layer of intrigue to it all. Did he feel that Canada would be better off with a new leader, someone who could start fresh with the incoming U.S. administration? Or was it more about internal pressures and wanting to give the Liberal Party a chance to regroup before the next election?
that's a really interesting question. It seems like the timing of his departure could be significant for a number of reasons.
Yeah, it definitely leaves a lot of unanswered questions about what's next for Canadian foreign policy. Trudeau's successor is going to inherit a pretty tangled web of relationships with the U.S. right at the top of the list.
You mentioned earlier that Trump has been critical of Canada. Could you talk a little more about that? What has he actually said or done that has Canadians worried?
Well, aside from that governor remark, which a lot of Canadians found insulting, Trump has also said he wants to renegotiate NAFTA, the trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. He often talks about trade in terms of winners and losers, and he's hinted that Canada has been taking advantage of the U.S. in these deals. That kind of talk creates a lot of uncertainty for Canadian businesses that rely on exporting to the U.S.
And then there's the whole issue of tariffs that you brought up earlier. What's the latest on that? Is there a real chance that Trump could actually impose those tariffs on Canadian goods?
The threat of tariffs has been hanging over U.S.-Canada relations for a while now. Trump has used tariffs as a bargaining chip before, and he's made it clear he's not afraid to do it again if he thinks it's necessary to protect American interests. So while there's no guarantee that he'll actually go through with it, the possibility is definitely there, and it's something that Canadian businesses and policymakers are taking very seriously.
So it sounds like Trudeau's successor is going to have a tough job managing the U.S. relationship. What about India? You mentioned there were tensions over the death of a Canadian citizen. How do you think that situation might play out under a new prime minister?
The situation with India is tricky. Trudeau's government took a strong stance demanding accountability from the Indian government and calling for full investigation into the death of that Canadian citizen. But India has denied any involvement and pushed back against Canada's accusations. It'll be interesting to see what approach Trudeau's successor takes. Will they keep pushing for answers, even if it risks further damaging relations with India? Or will they try to smooth things over and mend fences?
It seems like there's a lot at stake in both the U.S. and India relationships. What kind of impact do you think Trudeau's resignation will have on Canada's overall approach to foreign policy? Could we see a big shift in direction, or will it be more of a continuation of what Trudeau was doing?
That's the million-dollar question. It's too soon to say for sure what direction Canadian foreign policy will take under a new prime minister. But considering all the challenges and uncertainty Canada's facing on the world stage, some adjustments seem likely.
What kind of adjustments are you thinking about?
Well, for one thing, I think we might see a more practical approach to dealing with the U.S. Trudeau tried to keep things friendly with Trump, but his successor might be more willing to stand their ground, especially when it comes to trade and economic issues.
So maybe a bit more of a Canada-first approach.
Possibly. I think more and more Canadians feel like they need to put their own interests first, even if it means ruffling some feathers in Washington.
And what about the relationship with India? Any thoughts on how that might change?
I think the new prime minister will have to balance the importance of the relationship with India with the need to uphold Canadian values and principles. The death of that Canadian citizen raised serious questions about human rights and the rule of law, and Canada can't just ignore those issues to keep things friendly with India.
It sounds like whoever takes over from Trudeau will need to find a delicate balance between being practical and sticking to their principles.
Exactly. And that balancing act will be tested on many fronts, not just with the U.S. and India, but with other important partners around the world, too.
So what does all of this mean for the average Canadian Hayes? How might these shifts in foreign policy actually affect their lives?
Well, for one thing, the results of the U.S. trade negotiations could have a big impact on the Canadian economy. If Trump follows through with tariffs, it could mean higher prices for consumers and job losses in certain industries. But if Canada can get a good trade deal, it could boost economic growth and create new opportunities for Canadian businesses.
And what about the situation with India?
The tensions with India are already having negative consequences for Canadian businesses that operate there. If the relationship keeps getting worse, it could lead to even more economic losses and maybe even security risks for Canadians traveling to or living in India.
It sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty ahead for Canada's place in the world.
For sure. But uncertainty can also lead to new opportunities. Trudeau's resignation has opened the door for a new leader to step in and redefine Canada's role on the world stage.
It's a crucial moment for Canada.
It really is. And it's going to be fascinating to see how this next chapter plays out.
It's definitely a lot to think about for Canadians as they get ready to choose their next prime minister.
Absolutely. There are some big questions ahead about what kind of leader they need in these uncertain times. Do they want someone who will stand up to Trump or someone who will try to find common ground? And what about the relationship with India? Is fixing that the priority, or is it more important to strengthen ties with other allies?
It sounds like Canadians have a real decision to make about what path they want their country to take.
They do. And that decision will have a ripple effect, not just within Canada, but on its relationships with the U.S., India, and the rest of the world.
Well, you've certainly given our listeners a lot to consider today. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I think the main takeaway here is that Canada is at a turning point. Trudeau's resignation and all the changes happening globally, especially with the U.S. under Trump, have created a moment of uncertainty, but also a moment of possibility. The choices Canada's next leader makes will shape the country's direction for years to come.
It's a lot to take in, but your insights have been incredibly helpful in understanding this complex situation. Thanks for joining us today.
That was my pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Justin Trudeau's resignation and what it means for Canada's foreign policy. We've explored the many factors that led to his decision, from his declining popularity and internal party struggles to the pressure of a second Trump term and the strained relationship with India. We've also looked at the challenges and opportunities facing Canada's next leader as they navigate a world that's changing faster than ever. Hopefully, you've gained a better understanding of this crucial moment in Canadian history and the forces that will shape the country's future. Thanks for listening.